Okay, so what we're going to do now is run through how we're going to assemble the kit and intubate a patient with COVID-19. There'll be other content available for the team working and human factors involved with all of that are considerable. And similarly, PPE will be worn all the way through this procedure, which goes without saying. A couple of points I'd just like to raise. We've had a look at whether or not we should include a clamp to clamp the endotracheal tube, and what we find is that with the tubes that we use in the ICU, perhaps it's obvious, but they're actually very hard to kink and clamp even with a piece of surgical clamp. We can still breathe through the tube even with it clamped as much as we can. So we're not going to use a clamp. What we'll rely upon is good precautions, making sure our patient is muscle relaxed before we disconnect the tube, and always make sure that we're in PPE during this aerosol generating procedure. So I'm just going to assemble the kit now. So taking that knuckle off the corner, putting this catheter mount on, attaching the HME-F, and then putting the mask in place, and then connecting the capnography to the back of the filter, and that will go back to our machine. Our patient will be on 15 litres of oxygen via nasal cannula, or alternatively they'll be on a non-rebreather, but we would suggest that for apneic ventilation they be on 15 litres of oxygen nasal specs as well. In the rat rooms, this may cause a problem with multiple sources of oxygen required, one for this, I should put this on, one for your bag valve mask, and then one for the alternate oxygen supply to the patient as well. Hopefully that will be being addressed. You should have oxygen in the trolley that the patient's on, as well as one wall socket. So we'll put the oxygen mask on, and of course I'm not going to go through the drill for intubation, but suffice it to say, these patients will be profoundly hypoxemic, and that's, I guess, why they're getting intubated. And of course we all have concerns about exposing ourselves to aerosol. A decision is going to have to be made during this procedure as to how profoundly hypoxemic the patient is and how we're going to mitigate that. What would be ideal is that we give pre-oxygenation via the 15 litres of nasal specs, hold this mask here, drugs are administered, and we perform a rapid sequence induction with rapid apnea, so using 1.2 milligrams per kilogram of rocuronium as an example, not bagging the patient, performing direct or video laryngoscopy, securing the tube, inflating the cuff with, let's say, 10 mils of air prior to bagging the patient to ensure that there's no leak of air around the cuff, and then oxygen saturations will recover when we can safely bag the patient through the viral filter. If we give that as our plan A, and during this procedure the patient deteriorates, individuals will have to make the call as to whether or not they're going to provide positive pressure to a patient who's desaturating. It's worth remembering that during all of this is all an aerosol generating procedure. We'll be in PPE, and if the patient is otherwise going to succumb to hypoxemia, it may or may not be reasonable to provide positive pressure breaths to the patient. How I would suggest that is done would be to put in an appropriately sized oropharyngeal airway, two-handed technique on the mask, and with a second operator giving the minimum pressure possible to ensure that the chest rises and falls when supplying positive pressure breaths. Ideally, merely the act of the CPAP alone may be enough to recruit the patient and improve the oxygen saturation. Just have to see how it goes in that scenario. Okay, so we've pre-oxygenated the patient, we've given the drugs, we're performing laryngoscopy, we're putting the tube in. So scoop will go in, tube will go in, and we'll hook the patient up. At this point, the cuff will be inflated, and the patient is apneic. We'll inflate the cuff with a goodly volume of air. In the intensive care unit, we can look at this and adjust the pressure for an appropriate level to the patient, but for the purposes of securing the airway, 8 to 10 mils wouldn't seem not inappropriate to make sure that the cuff is secure. Then we take off the end of the mask and attach, I've made a mistake, as can happen. We attach the inline suction here, and then the apparatus proximal to the mask here. And we've now got the closed circuit that we wish to have. We'll then secure the intertracheal tube and then move over to the Oxylog ventilator when time is appropriate. It's worth noting that when you hook up the Oxylog, it also has an exhaust to air, and so it must always be hooked up this side of the HEPA filter.